program explores complex financial crimes and their global impact. The views expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of the producers and/or the host. From boardroom decisions to shadow banking, from Wall Street to the dark corners of the internet, this is From the Hill to the Trenches, the search for justice. I'm your host, Dorothy Hill. As a former Goldman Sachs associate who has worked in 5 countries, including Germany and Japan, trained in compliance by a former agent of the FBI, and advised both global banks and government agencies, I've witnessed how money moves through legitimate channels and shadowy networks. In this podcast, we investigate the world of financial crime, otherwise known as FinCrime, compliance, and the pursuit of justice. We talk to the insiders, the regulators, investigators, compliance officers, and occasionally the reformed criminals who understand how financial systems can be exploited and protected. From money laundering to sanctions evasion, cryptocurrency schemes to corporate fraud, we follow the money trail and examine the human impact of financial crime. Whether you're a finance professional, work in compliance or technology, or simply care about transparency and justice, join us as we navigate the complex intersection of money, power, and accountability. This is From the Hill to the Trenches, the search for justice. Hello, everyone. This is Dorothy Hill from the Hill to the Trenches, the search for justice. It's been a short hiatus since our last episode, and I'm very pleased to have our esteemed guest, Brett Erickson, who is here from the great state of
Arizona.
All right, Arizona. So Brett is joining us today after a wonderful introduction by a mutual friend. And that person told me that Brett is a stellar person and an expert on various topics that we address on this podcast. So those topics, just to remind everyone, include money laundering investigations, compliance for both U.S. and non-U.S. financial institutions, U.S. and global sanctions, as well as a myriad of geopolitical issues affecting the global financial system. So I'll go ahead and let Brett introduce himself and we'll get started.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate you including me here. My name is Brett Erickson. I am a financial crime expert that has done a multitude of different things, including history with JP Morgan and Morgan Stanley, as well as involvement with the currently on the board of DePaul Business School, Seton Hall School of Diplomacy and International Relations, and Loyola University School of Law's Center for Compliance Studies. And then also do quite a bit of publishing with Newsweek, The Hill, American Banker, ACAMS, ACFE. So cover a lot of recent events and almost always geopolitical, financial crime, or sanctions related.
So Brett, could you tell us about your training and certification? So for the audience, we are showing your LinkedIn profile, and there are many letters after your name. So one of them you mentioned is ACAMS. Another one is ACFE. Can you explain to the audience, what are those 2 acronyms and what do they stand for? What is the significance in financial services specifically?
Yeah. So these are the 2 largest financial crime bodies, training bodies that have examinations that you can prepare and take with ACAMS, which is the Association of Certified Anti-Money Laundering Specialists, and then with ACFE, which is the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners. These are something that I find significant value in, because in today's world of AI, being able to take a standardized exam that proves you know what you're talking about, I think is incredibly important. And these are the two biggest organizations that issue these certifications amongst various others.
Wonderful. Yes, we know in our field, global financial services, that those accreditations and certifications are very helpful, not only for people who are applying for jobs, but those who want to expand their skill set and knowledge. So, for example, I recently attended the annual conference of Association of Certified Fraud Examiners in Nashville, and they had many speakers addressing topics of current financial crime investigations. They spoke about the Karen Reed case in Massachusetts, for example. That was more on the fraud and the court case specifically, because the case was still literally wrapped up that prior week. And that being said, the ACAMS part of it is especially interesting because we have topics such as pig butchering, elder fraud abuse, and elder exploitation that we've addressed on this podcast. So let's delve right into our first topic, which is the U.S. Department of Treasury, FinCEN, manages a massive database of what's called suspicious activity reports that are filed by U.S. banks, credit unions, and other regulated financial institutions, even in entities such as a casino. Those reports are then read by 350 plus law enforcement agencies throughout the U.S. They are very important for law enforcement to piece together, in some cases, disparate and fragmented parts of a story that leads to a much wider case, investigation, and ultimately an arrest and prosecution of one or more people. Tell us about your experience with FinCEN, writing SARS, and your view on how this tool is especially useful for fighting crime.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is kind of the core of financial crime within financial institutions, banks, credit unions. And the reality is, with the increasing sophistication of financial crime, which is rapidly evolving, the ability for a bank necessarily to catch an individual is not going to be nearly as strong as when you're involving multiple different companies with multiple different reportings, and the federal agencies are able to put those together and create a more concrete visual of what's going on. So these suspicious activity reports are great because it just gives the banks an opportunity to really contribute and not feel, these aren't, if someone files a suspicious activity report, that client's not going to get arrested necessarily. It's not, a, terrible thing if a client has a suspicious activity. But when there's a pattern, especially as data aggregation and, machine learning is able to better decipher that data more effectively, it's becoming increasingly beneficial in the US and across the world too, to be using these suspicious activity reports to be able to catch these criminal networks.
Yes, thank you. And it's all part of the regulatory regime that banks and other regulated organizations are required to file those. Let's talk about the breach. There was a breach not too long ago within FinCEN, and many people were concerned that highly confidential information, including PII, personal identifiable information, had been breached by someone on the inside. Do you still believe, Brett, that there is insider threat at FinCEN, or have those patches been resolved?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think those patches ever necessarily will be resolved is kind of the reality. I mean, when you see the entities or nations that are trying to access these information, I mean, we see it all the time with, China and Russia, the payoffs being made to federal employees. Many people think, oh, I might lose my job. I might go to jail. I would need to be paid $10 million. A lot of these payoffs are $10,000, $20,000. They're not that substantial in the grand scheme of things. And that identifying information is really important to adversaries, to criminal networks, being able to sell that information. So while there's profitability in it, people are going to try and exploit that. And that's just a constant threat that needs to be addressed, every day.
Absolutely. When we think about the HR, human resources onboarding of an employee to FinCEN, most definitely there's a background check, very in-depth background interviews, reference checks, etc. However, just like any organization that faces the risk of insider fraud, they must continuously be vigilant about those people who have access to that information. Absolutely. And it is an important tool. So let's think about someone who is a compliance analyst just starting out, learning how to write a SAR report. What type of specific skills would you recommend to that person? Which specific accreditations, other than, say, CAMS and CFE?
Yeah, I mean, one that is far less common here in the US that's used all across Europe is the ICA, who they issue different accreditations that are very specific. One that I took earlier this year would be it was like financial crime and global banking and markets. So it looks at things like stock market manipulation and pump and dump schemes, which have been something the FBI has called out in recent months as an issue. And they just offer very specific looks. So if you're working in correspondent banking, they'll have something on that. And then the ACAMS ones do have the advanced accreditations as well. So they have the CAMS audit, the CAMS FCI, and the CAMS risk management, which is really, they're not cheap, which is unfortunate, but the reality is that the field, it's inherently a constantly evolving field. Criminals don't want to be caught. When they do get caught doing something, they're going to shift. So being able to stay up to date, stay educated, and continuing to improve is absolutely critical in this field.
Yes, there's another association in anti-money laundering that is offering, for example, a 3-hour SAR writing course for $99, which came across my email a few days ago. I forwarded it to my client team and others. I just thought that was, based on the very steep price of other accreditations, a great deal, especially for someone who, even in law enforcement, wants to understand how a well-written SAR is structured and presented, and then all of the background information in terms of transactions, etc. I'll give an example. Customer XYZ Corporation may have a commercial loan with, say, JP Morgan. However, they may have a letter of credit with a South Korean bank operating here in the US. So if both banks submit SARs, that is, their respective compliance teams do so, then the FBI, the New York NYPD, for example, together, they can look at those two reports and make a conclusion.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's a big aspect too. And I think when it comes to SARS and financial crime in general, uh, knowledge is power. And
Yes.
being able to connect, even if you're only working in AML and that's, your kind of silo, learning about sanctions and learning about fraud and trade-based money laundering will help you, even if it's not to a super deep degree. Just expanding your knowledge base and being able to connect the dots and learn things from other areas will help you be better at stopping crime and funding of these criminal entities.
Let's talk about the wider skill set that both compliance officers and like all of their supporting teams. We think about FIU, data analysts. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, the something that is very undervalued, but is being increasingly called out in the financial crime industry is understanding of geopolitics, and understanding how those shift. For example, in Syria, they've had a massive drug trafficking past with Captagon. And as Bashar al Assad has been now replaced, the government there is maybe not perfect, but they're cracking down on it. I mean, there is evidence that they're cracking down. So being able to assess, okay, how much focus are we putting on there compared to maybe right now Venezuela or Mexico, and being able to stay up to date with that, being able to stay up to date with what's going on in Russia with the Biden administration. There was a lot of sanctions put on Russia, and in the Trump administration, very few. We just pulled some off of Belarus for an interesting reason. So being able to stay up to date with those, understanding where the risks are, being able to understand country specific risk. If you have a risk rating of countries where every country is high risk, you don't have a risk rating. Being able to actually assess which countries are low risk, which countries are high risk, and understanding how rapidly that shifts is very critical to being effective in this field.
Absolutely. So banks use what is called a risk assessment. It incorporates all of those factors. It even analyzes the industries of the customers, whether they're retail customers, high risk areas like Mexico, or commercial customers, say operating in mining industry versus consumer goods. All of those categories and SIC codes are risk ranked within the various models, and they get tuned. The regulators come in and really kick the tires on those models. So it's really important, like you said, to understand country risk and be able to risk rank as well as properly calculate those customer risk ratings. And then switching gears over to sanctions, Brett, let's talk about sanctions in terms of US sanctions, EU sanctions. How do banks manage those in terms of the information flow? What comes on, what goes off? And what is your view in terms of how financial institutions can manage the sanctions process much better?
Yeah. So in understanding sanctions, the, I guess, core definition of sanctions is an economic tool employed to change the behavior or actions of another country or entity. So it's different than, say, money laundering or something like that. These are very specific and targeted and very severe. OFAC has a SDN list, specially designated individuals who are need to be blocked, all their transactions, as well as places that they have ownership of. And this can be really challenging, especially when we look at, when we look at AML, it could be a local drug dealer or something like that, where bad, not a good thing to be doing, but the resources that they might have available to them could be quite limited. When we're looking at sanctions, especially broad, I mean, the biggest employment we've seen is on Russia. That is a country that has a large amount of oligarchs with deep governmental ties, and you're looking at the Kremlin level evasion that are trying to circumvent those and trying to get money into the US financial system. So the level of complexity when it comes to sanctions can be backed by hundreds or thousands of people all working in coordination compared to money laundering, which might be, one or two people trying to do it. So it's a very challenging thing for banks to do. But a lot of it's going to come to people educating, staying up to date. How have sanctions been evaded? What are people doing if it's not a country level, if it's a individual level? How are they going about it? What are they manipulating? What have they manipulated in the past? And being able to, again, knowledge is power on this. And it's very important, especially in the context of Russia, where it's trying to be used to end a humanitarian catastrophe and a military catastrophe. So it's very important from a moral and ethical standpoint, too.
Absolutely. And then the other aspect of compliance in our world is the PEP, or politically exposed person. We have both U.S. PEPs and non-U.S. PEPs. Many of those Kremlin officials, as you mentioned, are classified as PEPs, and that leads to a customer risk rating, which should be high risk if the bank's or financial institution rating system works properly. Then the banks have to manage those relationships and also really engage in what's called enhanced due diligence, or EDD. So all of these terms that we're using, we've talked a little bit about them on former podcast episodes, like with Brett Barker of the FBI. We talk about the money laundering that is driven by the cartels out of Mexico. So FinCEN back in June, this past June, issued an order against 3 specific Mexican banks, informing all of the U.S. legal entities that are banks, credit unions, casinos, money exchange entities, etc., to be not only on the alert, but to specifically ban payments. So, for example, ACHs and wires to those specific banks in Mexico. And there is some legal action going on. Can you speak about that?
Yeah. So a lot of these are tied to fentanyl, and the proceeds of which being funneled through those banks, and a level of complicity from those banks in that. As the again, context is so important, where especially when we look at money laundering, it's not binary like it is necessarily with sanctions. If you miss it, that's a big problem. With money laundering, banks are going to miss money laundering. It's just a inevitability and a part of running a financial institution. It's going to slip through the cracks, and you need to do everything you can to stop it. But if it's not as binary, what is really important is the direction from the US government wanting banks and financial institutions to be focused on a national security aspect to money laundering. And this has shifted dramatically in the last 9 months under the Trump administration. There's a very clear focus on drug trafficking, with the tariffs imposed on Canada directly tied to fentanyl trafficking, the 3 Mexican banks being quote unquote sanctioned for drug trafficking, and then the current military buildup in Venezuela, and also the cartel de los Sols in Venezuela as well, tied to Maduro. So this is a big focus, and the banks need to understand the national security implications to these things. And when these banks are targeted, if those are missed and they're able to conduct transactions, your company is looking to have the hammer brought down on them from the Trump administration, because contrary to many other things, this has been very clearly communicated. And this poses very large reputational risk, especially as it is such a focus from the current administration. So it's good that they've provided this level of communication and direction. And now it's important for the banks to do their part too, to protect the American population.
Right. So what they do is there's a look back period. They may go back 3 years or 4 years and literally pull all the transactions, i.e. payments to those banks, and then institute updated procedures to literally filter those banks, that is legal entities, through their various compliance systems and halt the payments. So you have both automated controls in the various systems to literally stop a payment or seize a payment. And in addition, you have the human element. Like you said, if something slips between the cracks, let's say that something is not spelled precisely and they're not capturing the ABA or routing number, which they should, but they don't, that payment gets through. That bank is at high risk of being fined and sanctioned. So, or literally censured or delicensed in a worst case scenario. I know, Brett, we're going to share the amazing list of your articles. You've written over 30 articles this year. You're really on a roll. You've written for The Hill, Newsweek, Nikkei. Can you tell us about the other financial related and sanctions related media appearances and articles you've written so that our audience can expand their knowledge?
Yeah. So Newsweek has been great to me. I really appreciate the team over there. I've published 5 articles this year, most recently just the other week on the secondary sanctions and kind of what that landscape looks like, as well as being quoted as a sanctions expert 4 times over the last few weeks, talking about drug trafficking, particularly focused on Venezuela and the actions happening over there. But then outlets like American Banker, Nikkei Asia, which is a very prominent Asian outlet, not very widely consumed in the US, but over in Asia, widely consumed. And then ACAMS Today, ACFE Fraud Magazine, Real Clear World, Real Clear Defense, a multitude, as well as quotes in Reuters and The Banker as well. And I mean, for me, it's great because I really enjoy, current events, geopolitics, in the Diplomat, which is Asia Pacific focus outlet. I wrote on how China and Russia are moving dual use exports through Kurdistan, as well as how Russia utilized Kyrgyzstan to conduct their A7, A5 crypto to launder quite a substantial amount of money. And it's these things where you might not be interested in geopolitics. That's fine. You might not be interested in sanctions. That's fine. But there is a imperative to understand it regardless. It's not if you want to be effective, I mean, from a moral aspect, I mean, if you are wanting to save lives, stop drug trafficking, stop I mean, a very big aspect is stopping the war in Ukraine via sanctions. You have to stay up to date. You have to understand how money laundering is happening, how sanction evasion is happening, and it's a imperative to stay up to date and stay educated. Maybe you don't want to write an article about it and you don't want to dive that deep. That's okay. But staying up to date is absolutely mandatory in this field.
Absolutely. We talk about these transnational criminal enterprises, and fentanyl is a great example. Anything that's synthetic opioid, where the core ingredients may be manufactured in China, come in through Mexico, are produced there, and then across our borders. It's not just across the southern border, it's across the Canadian border, could be very small ports of entry, say the Carolinas, shipping containers. I just recently learned that a very low percentage of them are audited. They literally do not open them and check for what's inside. So you have a high risk profile within the shipping industry, cargo. And then finally, how does this impact us? I'm a mom, and I think about the risks on the street to the youth. Young people go to a party, they may see a pill that's brightly colored that could contain fentanyl. And we always hear about very sad stories of overdoses, misuse, or just simply a young person experimenting, and we lose lives. So there really is a crisis on our streets, in our neighborhoods. And then we take it all the way back up to the macro level and understand why these FinCEN orders and the advisories related to them, in some cases, are so important to stop that money flow. And like you said, it's not possible to create stop gaps everywhere. However, it is a highly concerted effort on the part of financial institutions to comply with those orders and the regulations. Is there anything else you want to add about the role of FinCEN or sanctions, even coming out of, say, the EU, where they might differ from sanctions issued by the US?
Yeah. I mean, the EU has implemented a lot of, I think they're under 18th package of sanctions implementation. There's been a lot of focus on maybe strong push from the EU to impose secondary sanctions on Russia, which is different. There's a misconception due to maybe inaccurate wording from the current administration that secondary sanctions had been imposed on India. That's not the case. There were tariffs, and the difference is pretty substantial in terms of the impact. But that is something that, again, staying abreast of the happenings around the world, it's probably worth taking a look at, okay, what are the major companies in India? Who is likely to be sanctioned? Let's kind of build out some of this proactively so that when they're imposed, we aren't scrambling behind the 8 ball here to be able to effectively impose these, and we're not liable for a major penalty. And then again, with money laundering, I think the aspect here in the US that the people need to understand is many people in financial crime operate under the approach that all financial crime is bad and all financial crime needs to be stopped, period. It is great. I agree. However, in operating a business, you have profit and you have revenues, and you're not going to get $20 billion to crack down on your AML in a single year. You're going to get a far lower budget than you'd like, and it's not going to be enough, and you're going to ask for more, and you're not going to get it. So now you need to take a risk-based approach. You need to understand, okay, what are the major things? Actually prioritize those. And the US government has clearly stated that
they understand deprioritizing lower risks, and especially lower risk compared to national security. So understanding the reality of, if you want no financial crime, don't open a financial institution. If you have a financial institution, it's going to happen, and it's not good, but you need to understand that so that you can effectively approach it, effectively budget for it, and effectively risk weight where you need to be allocating funds.
And I'll take an example for the audience. So you may have an auto parts company. That's a high risk industry. It's cash based in many cases. And there may be someone locally who's running, say, a narcotics and sex trafficking operation. And in order to launder the cash that they garner from that illegal activity, they may pump it through like purchases of auto parts, then they resell those, or they may go and put down a deposit for a yacht, for example. So those are examples of how cash makes its way into the financial system through what is perceived as that person having, let's say, a boat repair company. So the bank has that John Taylor as boat repair company owner XYZ, and they don't know that it's a front for, the human and sex trafficking / narcotics trafficking operation, which is really the meat. That's where the high cash flow is for them. So it's very challenging for especially small banks and credit unions that simply don't have, like you said, the larger budgets to pay for experienced and well-versed staff. It's very competitive out there for compliance officers, AML analysts, because their skills are so much in demand. Someone like you, who is a consultant, you can add value to various clients and then conduct, your great media work on the side. Let's switch gears over to some of the more complex cross-border issues. Let's delve into, say, some of the emerging trends in like crypto. What are some of the challenges that you see for financial institutions such as JP Morgan Chase in managing those transnational money flows and what we call digital and cryptocurrencies?
Yeah, so I had a great conversation just the other day with someone in Australia, where they are really struggling with the regulation of crypto and the challenges at a high level in many Southeast Asian countries where they have outlawed that use, which is problematic because criminals tend to not really care about the law. But what happens is that then there's no government oversight and they're not looking to catch it. They are more or less ignoring it. It's happening regardless, but because there's no oversight, they're not working to stop it. And many companies, especially in, many countries, what happens in crypto is a lot of times they spin up a new company really quickly, onboard a lot of clients, get some revenues, and sell it to a bigger company. So they don't really care to have those compliance guardrails because it's gone. They sold it and profited, and now it's someone else's problem. But with crypto as well, we had the mixers in Tornado, where basically you pay into a larger pool. That pool is mixed together with assets of other people, and when you withdraw it, spits out assets from the pool. Who did it come from? Don't know. And those are the kind of things that are just rapidly evolving. I think from a banking aspect, when you look at financial crime, you have a majority of the people working in AML or fraud, and a smaller subsection working in sanctions or human trafficking or things of that nature. But amongst a small subset of whether it's sanctions or AML, you're only getting, let's say 50% of people working in AML and 10% working in sanctions. Of that subset, you now only have a subset of that is actually fluent in crypto. So the pool of expertise gets increasingly smaller, and it becomes, again, the imperative to educate yourself on what is happening and how is it happening, who's doing it, what are the methods that are being employed, because it's money laundering, it's drug trafficking. I mean, it is every bit the same as through cash. It's funding and allowing revenues to become legitimized by criminal entities or countries. So I think many people in a younger generation might be more inherently versed in crypto, but it just doesn't matter. You have to learn it. And I personally, I've never invested in crypto ever. It doesn't matter. I have to learn it because that's how things are happening now. And adoption is happening very rapidly in particularly the US. So it's now or never, because things are going to start slipping through the cracks very quickly.
And I remember when crypto really took off, we had a group of students from Dartmouth tour various companies in Manhattan. So we took them to Barclays investment banking, and one of the first crypto startups, which was started by a fellow Goldman Sachs alum, we just started the students by teaching them about blockchain. And then we took them back to the history of a swap transaction. And then we helped them to follow that progression, like a typical swap transaction on Wall Street between two banks, then blockchain, and eventually crypto. And it was really fascinating at the time. No one was really thinking about Coinbase or what we call the plumbing of crypto. Now, many of the discussions are around, which infrastructure plays do you own? Like which XY, what all the various acronyms they throw around, and the various companies that comprise the plumbing of the cryptocurrency movement around the globe. And like you said, it is very hard to keep up with that unless you're really a subject matter expert. Many of the U.S. regulators have taken a conservative stance in terms of permitting that type of activity and really delving into the legal definition of a particular crypto asset, which means that obviously the banks have to be in compliance. So thank you for talking about crypto. There are definitely more episodes that we can run on that topic in particular. Just as we wrap up, if someone wants to enter compliance working for a bank, Brett, if they had 6 months to prepare and learn as much as they can and get certifications, what would you recommend to them?
Yeah, great question. I mean, on the topic of crypto, I mean, Chainalysis and TRM Labs both have great educational tools available. I think that ACAMS is great. ACAMS is expensive. It's, $2,000 to $3,000 per certification. And if you're looking at a couple, that could be $6,000 to $10,000. So that may not be your best bet. But ICA does have really good options for those. ACAMS does have trains and things of that nature that are, more modestly priced. Same with ACFE. And then to me, if you're an applicant, I don't care what you write in your job description, because you're incentivized to paint yourself in the best light because you want to get a job. You need to prove it. So whether that is a certification or an educational program, Stanford offers continuing education. I took geopolitics in the 21st century Middle East and one on China and Russia and the revisionism that happens there. I think they're like $180 for a quarter long class from Stanford professors. A great option. Writing. I think a lot of people think there is such a high barrier to writing and publishing. And don't get me wrong. I mean, if you're trying to write for the Wall Street Journal, if as much as I've written and as much credentialing that I have, I might have a 3% chance of landing an article there. It's not very likely. May not be worth my time. But if you're writing for ACAMS or ACFE or other outlets, I mean, Compliance Week is a great one. They have a ton of great materials. The editor-in-chief there is fantastic. Expertise comes from research. That's just what it is at the end of the day. You might not know or feel you know enough, but everyone has different perspectives and different just life experience and are able to connect the dots in a different manner. In that public conversation that happens from articles being written from different perspectives is what drives the industry forward. So don't feel that if your article doesn't get accepted, that it's because of you. If you write the best article in the world for The Hill, probably a 20% chance of acceptance. It's just a reality. It's tough. But you can learn so much just by doing your own research and being able to do that. And then that's a big separator for someone entering. If you've published, if you have certification, if you have something that can prove that you know what you're doing. Everyone on earth is in the 90th percentile of performance for their company. Unfortunately, that's not the way numbers work. Having something that you can prove to say, hey, I passed this standardized exam, there's a public database for ACAMS and who's passed what. I have this baseline of education. That says a lot to, employers and being able to say, okay, we have external sign off from ACAMS. This person has a baseline knowledge on this topic.
That's all really great advice. So you link that with references, your LinkedIn profile, recommendations. I definitely tell people who are in college, start your LinkedIn profile while you're in college. It will help you to land an internship. You can start building your network. So on that note, Brett, I just want to say thank you so much for joining us today. We really covered quite a few topics in the world of financial compliance and FinCrimes, from sanctions to OFAC to the FinCEN SAR writing and submission and law enforcement use of those reports, all the way over to geopolitical issues, PEPs, and a myriad of other topics. So anyone who's interested in learning more, just reach out to me on the main site, which is www.hill2trenches.com. We'll be happy to respond to you. A member of my team will do so. If you're also interested in being a guest on our podcast, you can do so on that same website. Brett, I thank you again for joining us today. You've been a stellar guest, a great source of information, not just for seasoned compliance officers and those of us who are subject matter experts on Wall Street and on Main Street, but also to those who are aspiring to join the ranks of the financial services firms, whether it's here in the U.S. Or overseas. So thank you again. Do you have anything else to add as we sign off?
No, I just appreciate your time. Appreciate everyone listening. And you can find me on LinkedIn. It's Brett Erickson, and then plenty of letters after that. It'll probably stick out. Anyone can feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions, need any guidance. I'm always happy to take the time to help.
Great. Thank you, and enjoy the weekend.
You've been listening to From the Hill to the Trenches, The Search for Justice. I'm Dorothy Hill. Financial crime, or FinCrime, may seem distant and abstract, but its effects touch all of us through market instability, compromised institutions, and eroded trust in our financial systems. If today's discussion has sparked your interest, there are ways to stay engaged. Visit our website, www.hill2trenches.com. That's number 2, hill2trenches.com, where you will find resources, extended interviews, and case studies mentioned in this episode. Follow us on social media at Hill Trenches, that's trenches plural, at Hill Trenches, for daily insights and breaking news in the world of financial integrity. Most importantly, share what you've learned. Greater awareness is the first step toward a more transparent financial system that works for everyone, not just for those who know how to exploit it. Until next time, remember, following the money reveals the truth, and truth is the foundation of justice. Join us again next week as we continue our search for justice in the complex world of global finance.